My stepdaughter called me Dad at graduation. Her biological father showed up drunk, screaming, "I stole his family." She handed him the restraining order instead. The auditorium went silent the second Derek stumbled through the doors, his dress shirt untucked and stained, his face flushed that particular shade of red that comes from day drinking and rage. Sophie froze on stage mid-sentence, her valedictorian speech forgotten, the microphone trembling in her hand. I was sitting in the third row next to her mother, Amy, who'd gone rigid beside me, her fingers digging into my forearm hard enough to leave marks. 300 people turned to watch Derek weave down the center aisle, pointing at me with one hand while clutching a half-empty bottle in the other. "That's him," Derek slurred loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's the bastard who stole my family, my daughter, my wife, my whole goddamn life." Security was already moving toward him, 2 uniformed officers converging from different angles. But Derek had momentum and alcohol-fueled determination. He made it halfway to the stage before they caught his arms, and that's when he started screaming about how I'd destroyed everything, how Sophie was his blood, how no piece of paper could change that she belonged to him. Sophie stood there under the stage lights looking smaller than her 18 years, her graduation gown suddenly seeming too big for her frame, her carefully written speech still clutched in shaking hands. I wanted to go to her, wanted to shield her from this public humiliation on what should have been her proudest day, but Amy's grip held me in place, and maybe that was for the best. This wasn't about me. This was about Sophie, and whatever decision she was about to make about how to handle the father who'd abandoned her 6 years ago showing up drunk to her graduation. The principal had made it to the microphone, was asking for calm and order, suggesting security remove the disturbance so they could continue the ceremony. But Sophie held up one hand, a gesture so commanding that everyone, including the principal, went quiet. She set down her speech, walked to the edge of the stage, and looked directly at the man who was still struggling against the security officers holding him back. Her voice when she spoke was steady, clear, amplified by the microphone she'd picked back up with hands that had stopped shaking. "Derek Mallory," she said, using his full name instead of calling him Dad or Father or anything that suggested a relationship. "I have something for you." She reached into her graduation gown and pulled out a folded document, held it up so everyone could see the official court seal visible, even from a distance. "This is a restraining order. It was granted 3 weeks ago. You're not supposed to be within 500 feet of me, my mother, or my stepfather. By coming here today, you've violated it. The police have already been called." The auditorium erupted in whispers and gasps. Derek stopped struggling, his face going from red to white as he processed what she'd said. Sophie descended the stage steps carefully, her movements precise and deliberate, and walked directly to where Derek stood between the 2 security officers. She handed him the document, then stepped back and addressed the crowd with a composure that broke my heart, because no 18-year-old should have to be this strong, this prepared for their father's worst behavior. "My biological father is an alcoholic who chose drinking over his family. He hasn't paid child support in 6 years. He's broken into our home twice, stolen from us, threatened my mother, and made my childhood a nightmare of broken promises and midnight phone calls where he'd scream about how we betrayed him. The man sitting in row 3, the one Derek just called a bastard, is the man who taught me to drive, who stayed up helping me with college applications, who walked me through panic attacks when Derek's harassment got too bad, who loved me when I was unlovable because I was so angry about everything Derek had put us through. His name is Thomas Brennan, and he's been more of a father to me in 6 years than Derek was in 12. This restraining order isn't about revenge. It's about safety. It's about finally being able to graduate, go to college, and live my life without fear that Derek will show up drunk and violent and ruin everything like he's tried to do today." The police arrived then, 3 officers who'd clearly been briefed on the situation because they went straight to Derek and began reading him his rights. Derek's legs gave out and the security officers had to hold him up as the handcuffs went on. Amy was crying silently beside me, her mascara running in black streams down her cheeks, but she was also smiling, this broken, proud expression that said she couldn't believe her daughter had just done that. I sat there stunned, because I'd known about the restraining order, had helped Sophie file it after the last incident when Derek had shown up at her job and caused a scene that got her written up, but I hadn't known she was carrying it with her today. She'd planned for this. She'd known Derek might show up and she'd prepared for exactly this scenario. The officers escorted Derek out through the side exit to avoid the main doors where families would be leaving after the ceremony. Sophie watched him go with an expression I couldn't read, something between relief and grief, then turned back to face the auditorium full of people who were staring at her with various combinations of pity, admiration, and uncomfortable curiosity. She walked back to the podium, picked up her speech, and looked at the principal who nodded that she could continue. Her voice cracked on the first few words, but then steadied as she found her rhythm again. I had a whole speech prepared about overcoming obstacles and finding strength in adversity, but I think what just happened demonstrates that better than anything I could have written. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us most are the ones who hurt us worst. Sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves you through the ugly parts and celebrates the beautiful ones. To my classmates, if you're dealing with something similar, Know that you're not alone, and that there are people and systems in place to help you. To my mom and my dad, the real one, thank you for showing me what healthy love looks like." She finished her speech to a standing ovation that felt more emotional than celebratory, and when she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, the applause was deafening. Amy and I stood with everyone else, clapping until our hands hurt, watching this girl we'd both fought so hard to protect finally get her moment. But even in that victory, I felt the weight of everything that had led here. 6 years of custody battles and police reports and middle-of-the-night emergencies that had shaped all of us in ways we were still discovering. I met Amy 7 years ago at a support group for parents of children with anxiety disorders. Sophie had just turned 11 and was struggling with panic attacks that her therapist suggested might be related to her home environment. Amy had been separated from Derek for 8 months at that point, living in a rental house with Sophie while she saved money for a divorce lawyer. She was working 2 jobs, barely sleeping, trying to be everything her daughter needed while also rebuilding a life Derek had spent years systematically dismantling. I'd been there because my nephew was living with me temporarily after my sister's breakdown, and he was having similar anxiety issues related to family trauma. We'd connected over coffee after one of the meetings, exchanged numbers so we could share resources and recommendations, and that casual friendship had gradually become something more substantial as we realized we understood each other's situations in ways most people couldn't. The first time I met Sophie, she'd been guarded and quiet, answering my questions in monosyllables while watching me with the kind of careful assessment that kids develop when they've learned adults can't be trusted. Amy had warned me that Sophie didn't do well with her mother dating, that she'd sabotaged previous attempts because she was holding on to hope that her parents might reconcile despite all evidence that Derek was incapable of being the father or husband they needed. I'd understood that and hadn't pushed for more involvement than Sophie could handle, had let our relationship develop at her pace rather than trying to force connection. The turning point had come 4 months into my relationship with Amy, when Derek had shown up at their house at 2 a.m., drunk and belligerent, pounding on the door and screaming that Amy couldn't keep him from his daughter. Sophie had called me instead of 911, her voice small and terrified on the phone, asking if I could come because her mom was scared to open the door, but Derek wouldn't leave. I'd arrived to find Derek passed out on the front porch and had stayed until police came to remove him, then spent the rest of the night on Amy's couch because Sophie had asked me not to leave in case he came back. After that, something shifted in how Sophie viewed me, as if I'd passed some test I hadn't known I was taking. The divorce had been brutal even by contested custody standards. Derek had fought for full custody despite his documented alcoholism, had accused Amy of parental alienation, and me of being an inappropriate influence on his daughter. He'd hired an expensive lawyer his parents paid for and had dragged out proceedings for 18 months with constant motions and appeals, forcing Amy to spend money she didn't have on legal fees, while her own lawyer tried to document Derek's pattern of instability and substance abuse. I'd been deposed twice, asked intrusive questions about my relationship with Amy and Sophie, my background, my intentions, whether I was trying to replace Derek as Sophie's father. The questions had been designed to make me angry or defensive, to catch me saying something that could be used against Amy's custody case, but I'd stayed calm and factual because Sophie's well-being depended on the adults in her life not making this worse than it already was. The judge had ultimately granted Amy primary custody with Derek getting supervised visitation that he rarely used because he refused to stay sober long enough to pass the required drug and alcohol tests. Child support had been ordered but never paid, with Derek claiming unemployment despite evidence he was working under the table for his father's construction company. Amy had filed multiple enforcement actions, but the system moved slowly and Derek was skilled at hiding assets and income. By the time Sophie turned 14, Amy had stopped pursuing it because the stress of constant court battles was affecting Sophie more than the money would help. I'd quietly started contributing to Sophie's expenses, paying for things like school trips and sports equipment and eventually her car insurance, not because I was trying to buy her affection, but because she deserved opportunities that Amy couldn't afford alone, and I had the means to help. Sophie had been uncomfortable with this at first, had insisted on keeping a list of everything I spent so she could pay me back someday, but eventually she'd accepted that people who love you sometimes help without expecting repayment. The first time she'd called me dad had been an accident, a slip during a stressful moment when I was helping her study for finals, and she'd been exhausted and frustrated. She'd immediately apologized, her face going red, stammering that she didn't mean to disrespect Derek or make me uncomfortable. I told her she could call me whatever felt natural, that I wasn't offended or uncomfortable, and that titles mattered less than the relationship they represented. After that, she'd used it occasionally when we were alone or with Amy, but never in public or around Derek's family, some unspoken agreement that we were protecting ourselves from the drama that honesty would create. Derek's parents had made it clear they viewed me as an interloper, who'd taken advantage of Amy's vulnerability and stolen their granddaughter from their son. They'd filed for grandparent visitation rights, had showed up at Sophie's school events and sports games, had sent letters to Sophie blaming Amy and me for the distance in their relationship, while never acknowledging Derek's role in creating that distance. Sophie had been caught between love for her grandparents and loyalty to the home Amy and I had built, and eventually she'd chosen to limit contact because the emotional manipulation had become too painful. The harassment had escalated over the years in ways that were hard to prove, but impossible to ignore. Derek would drive past our house at odd hours, always finding plausible reasons if police questioned him. He'd create fake social media accounts to monitor Sophie's posts and send her messages alternating between declarations of love and accusations of betrayal. He'd call Amy's employer claiming she was an unfit mother, forcing her to explain the situation to supervisors who then treated her differently. He'd filed false CPS reports twice, triggering investigations that found nothing wrong, but left Sophie feeling violated and angry that strangers had been brought into their home to ask invasive questions. Each incident individually seemed minor, but collectively they created an atmosphere of constant vigilance, where we were always waiting for Derek's next move. The restraining order had become necessary after Derek had confronted Sophie at her workplace 3 months before graduation, showing up drunk during her shift at the library and causing a scene that required security intervention. He'd accused her of abandoning him for people who didn't really love her, had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises when she'd tried to walk away, had screamed that she was an ungrateful bitch, just like her mother. Her co-workers had intervened and called police, but Derek had left before they arrived. Sophie had finally agreed that legal protection was necessary because Derek's behavior was escalating, and she was genuinely afraid of what he might do as her graduation approached, and the reality of her leaving for college made his loss of control complete. The restraining order hearing had been one of the hardest things I'd witnessed, watching Sophie testify about her father's behavior while Derek sat across the courtroom looking simultaneously defiant and pathetic. She'd presented years of documentation with the help of her lawyer, a woman named Patricia Nowak, who specialized in family law and had taken Sophie's case pro bono after hearing about the situation. Text messages where Derek had threatened violence, voicemails filled with drunken rage, photos of the bruises from the library incident, testimony from witnesses who'd seen Derek's harassment over the years. Derek's lawyer had tried to paint Sophie as a manipulated child who'd been turned against her father by a vindictive ex-wife and an overreaching stepfather, had suggested Sophie was exaggerating or lying about the abuse to justify cutting Derek out of her life. But Sophie had been unshakable in her testimony, had calmly recounted incident after incident with dates and specifics that made her credibility obvious. The judge had granted the restraining order for 3 years, through Sophie's college graduation, with stern warnings to Derek about the consequences of violation. Derek had stormed out of the courtroom before the hearing ended, and his lawyer had later withdrawn from the case, citing ethical concerns, which suggested Derek had done or said something that made even his own attorney uncomfortable. We'd hoped the restraining order would provide closure, would be the boundary that finally allowed Sophie to move forward without Derek's shadow following her. But part of me had known he'd violate it eventually, because men like Derek don't accept boundaries. They see them as challenges to be overcome, or punishments to be protested. The graduation party at our house that evening was smaller than we'd originally planned, just close family and Sophie's best friends who understood the complicated dynamics and wouldn't ask intrusive questions about what had happened at the ceremony. Sophie seemed lighter somehow, as if publicly confronting Derek had released weight she'd been carrying for years. She laughed more freely, hugged people harder, talked about college plans with genuine excitement instead of the guarded optimism she'd shown before. Amy kept crying happy tears and apologizing for crying, overwhelmed by relief that Sophie had survived childhood relatively intact, despite everything Derek had tried to destroy. I mostly stayed in the background, manning the grill and restocking drinks, content to watch Sophie celebrate with people who actually cared about her well-being. But late in the evening, after most guests had left, Sophie found me cleaning up the backyard and asked if we could talk privately. We sat on the deck stairs overlooking the garden Amy had planted 3 years ago when we'd bought this house together, the first real home any of us had felt safe in. "I need to tell you something," Sophie said, her voice serious enough to spike my concern, "about why I knew Derek would show up today." I waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace, fighting the urge to jump in with reassurances or questions. "He called me 2 nights ago from a blocked number. He was drunk, but coherent enough to tell me exactly what he planned to do. He said he'd ruin my graduation, make sure everyone saw what I'd become, that I'd be embarrassed in front of the whole school. He said I could stop it by dropping the restraining order and agreeing to see him again. He said if I really loved him, I'd choose him over you." The fury that rose in my chest was immediate and hot, but I kept my voice level. "Why didn't you tell us? We could have gotten additional security or—" "Because I wanted him to do it," Sophie interrupted. "I wanted him to violate the order in the most public way possible, so there'd be dozens of witnesses, and no way his lawyer could claim it was a misunderstanding. I wanted everyone to see exactly who he is instead of the image his parents keep trying to maintain." The calculation in her strategy was both impressive and heartbreaking, this 18-year-old who'd learned to think tactically about her own father's behavior. That was a huge risk, I said carefully. If security hadn't gotten to him in time, you were there, Sophie said simply. You and Mom and half the police department because we'd warned them he might show up. I knew I'd be safe, and I needed to take control of the narrative instead of always being the victim of his choices. We sat in silence for a moment, the evening air heavy with humidity and the sound of cicadas. Sophie picked at a thread on her graduation gown that she still hadn't taken off. The thing I've never told you, she said quietly, is that I remember when he was good, before the drinking got bad, when I was really little. There were times when he was the dad I needed. He taught me to ride a bike. He made up bedtime stories. He came to my dance recitals. I'm not traumatized because I never had a good father. I'm traumatized because I had one and watched him choose alcohol over me again and again until there was nothing left of the person he used to be. The grief in her voice was raw and real, and I understood then that today hadn't just been about justice or safety. It had been about mourning the father she'd lost and accepting that he wasn't coming back. I'm sorry you had to lose that, I said, meaning it completely. I'm sorry Derek couldn't be who you needed him to be. Sophie nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. But I'm not sorry you're here. I know I don't say it enough, but you've been exactly what I needed even when I fought against it. You never tried to replace him or make me pretend he didn't exist. You just showed up consistently and let me figure out what our relationship could be. That's the thing Derek never understood. Love isn't about ownership or blood. It's about showing up day after day even when it's hard. She leaned her head against my shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that still felt precious even after years of smaller versions. I'm scared about what happens next. About college and leaving you and Mom. About whether Derek will escalate or finally give up. About whether I'll ever stop waiting for him to ruin important moments. Those fears are valid, I said, putting an arm around her shoulders. And I can't promise Derek won't try to interfere again. But I can promise that your mom and I will be here to help you handle whatever comes. You're not facing any of this alone. We stayed like that until Amy came looking for us, worried we'd gotten lost in conversation and missed cake. The three of us stood together on the deck, Sophie between us, and I felt the fragile strength of the family we'd built from broken pieces and careful choices. It wasn't the family any of us had imagined, but it was real and fought for and worth protecting. The next morning, I woke to my phone ringing at 6 a.m., Patricia Nowak's name on the screen. She apologized for the early call, but wanted me to know that Derek had been charged with violating the restraining order and was being held pending an emergency hearing. The prosecutor was pushing for maximum penalties given the public nature of the violation and Derek's history of harassment. There was also video from the graduation ceremony that had gone viral online, tens of thousands of views of Sophie's speech and Derek's arrest. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on Sophie's side, with comments praising her courage and condemning Derek's behavior. But there was also the inevitable backlash, people questioning why Sophie had humiliated her father publicly, instead of handling it privately, suggesting she was being manipulated by Amy and me. Armchair psychologists analyzing her trauma and relationships based on 2 minutes of footage. Patricia wanted to prepare us for media attention and potential interview requests, suggesting we decline all of them and let Sophie's statement at graduation stand as the final word on the situation. I thanked her for the call and the advice, then went to wake Amy and Sophie with the news. Amy's first reaction was relief, followed immediately by concern about what Derek's parents would do with this information. They'd been silent since the restraining order was granted, but we all knew this would force them to take a position publicly. Sophie's reaction was harder to read, some combination of satisfaction and sadness that suggested she was still processing the enormity of what she'd done and what it meant for any possibility of future relationship with Derek. The emergency hearing happened later that week, with Derek appearing via video from county jail, looking haggard and defeated. His new lawyer, a public defender who'd been assigned to the case, tried arguing that Derek's appearance at graduation was motivated by love and that his intoxication made him unable to fully understand the restraining order's terms. The prosecutor destroyed that argument with evidence that Derek had received multiple copies of the order, had been explicitly warned by his previous lawyer about consequences of violation, and had called Sophie 2 days before graduation with what amounted to threats. The judge revoked Derek's bail and sentenced him to 90 days for contempt of court, with additional penalties pending the outcome of criminal charges for assault threats and harassment. Derek's parents were in the courtroom and tried to speak during public comment, painting their son as a victim of circumstances and blaming Amy and me for destroying their family. The judge shut them down quickly, noting that their enabling behavior had likely contributed to Derek's inability to accept responsibility for his choices. Sophie didn't attend the hearing, a decision we'd supported because she'd already said everything that needed saying at graduation. She spent that afternoon with her best friend Zara packing for college and acting like a normal teenager excited about her future instead of a young woman dealing with her father's incarceration. But that night, after Zara had left and the house was quiet, I found Sophie in her room staring at a photo album from her childhood. Pictures of Derek holding her as a baby, teaching her to swim, smiling at birthday parties before alcohol had hollowed him out. "Do you think he'll ever get better?" she asked, without looking up from the photos. I honestly don't know, I said, sitting on the edge of her bed. Addiction is complicated, and Derek has to want recovery badly enough to do the work. So far, he's chosen to blame everyone else instead of facing his own responsibility. That might change, or it might not. Sophie closed the album carefully. I used to think if I was good enough, smart enough, successful enough, he'd want to stay sober for me, like I could be worth more than the alcohol. The pain in that statement was visceral, the core wound that probably every child of an addict carries. His addiction was never about your worth, I said firmly. You've always been more than enough. Derek's inability to see that is his failure, not yours. She nodded, but I could tell part of her still didn't fully believe it, might never fully believe it no matter how much evidence accumulated otherwise. I'm going to write him a letter, she said after a long pause. Not to send, just to get everything out that I've never been able to say. My therapist suggested it might help with closure. I told her that sounded like a healthy idea and offered to be available if she wanted to talk through anything that came up while writing. She thanked me, and then asked the question I'd been waiting for since the graduation incident. Do you wish you'd never gotten involved with us? Like, do you ever regret taking on all this drama when you could have had a normal life? I looked at this remarkable young woman who'd survived so much and was still worried about being a burden to people who loved her. Not for 1 second, I said. You and your mom are the best thing that ever happened to me. The drama came from Derek's choices, not from loving you. And I'd choose this complicated, messy, beautiful family over easy and normal every single time. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Thanks, Dad, she said, the title deliberate and meaningful now instead of an accidental slip. For everything. 2 months later, I helped Sophie move into her dorm room at the university 3 hours away, carrying boxes up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken. Amy cried through most of the process, alternating between excitement that Sophie was starting this new chapter and sadness that our house would feel empty without her daily presence. Sophie bore her mother's emotions with patient affection, understanding that this transition was hard for Amy in ways that went beyond normal parental adjustment. We'd never been able to give Sophie the security of knowing she'd always had a stable home, and sending her off to college felt like finalizing proof that she'd made it through childhood relatively intact. The campus was beautiful, old brick buildings and tree-lined paths, exactly the kind of place Sophie had dreamed about when she'd started researching colleges sophomore year. Her roommate was a friendly girl from California named Iris, who was studying environmental science and seemed genuinely excited to meet Sophie. We stayed for orientation events, helped Sophie set up her meal plan and class schedule, took embarrassing amounts of photos that Sophie tolerated with good humor. When it was time to leave, Amy hugged Sophie for a full minute, whispering things I couldn't hear but that made Sophie cry and laugh at the same time. Then Sophie turned to me, and there was weight in her expression that suggested this goodbye meant something more than just physical distance. You changed my life, she said simply. You showed me what a father should be, and that's going to matter for the rest of my life. Thank you for choosing us when you didn't have to. I hugged her hard, this girl who'd become my daughter in every way that mattered, and told her I was proud of her and that she could call any time for any reason. The drive home was quiet, Amy and I both lost in our own thoughts about what Sophie's leaving meant for the family structure we'd built. That evening, I found a letter in my bag that Sophie must have slipped in when I wasn't looking. In it, she'd written about the specific moments when she'd realized I was safe, when she'd started letting me into her life, when she'd stopped seeing me as a threat to her father and started appreciating me as my own person. She wrote about the guilt she'd carried for loving me when it felt like betraying Derek, and how she'd finally understood that loving me didn't diminish what Derek could have been if he'd made different choices. She thanked me for the small things, helping with homework and driving her to early morning practice and staying up late listening to boy drama, but also for the big things, standing between her and Derek's chaos and showing her that masculinity could be gentle and consistent. The letter ended with a line that broke me open. You didn't give me the childhood I deserved, because Derek took that before you got here, but you gave me the tools to build the life I deserve, and that's actually more important. I sat with that letter for a long time, crying in a way I rarely let myself, grieving for everything Sophie had lost while celebrating everything she'd become despite it. 3 years later, I'm sitting in another auditorium watching Sophie graduate again, this time from college with honors and acceptances to multiple graduate programs. Amy is beside me, grayer now but more relaxed, the constant vigilance of Sophie's childhood finally easing as Derek remained absent from her life. He'd been released from jail after serving his full sentence and had immediately violated probation by attempting to contact Sophie through her grandmother. That violation had sent him back for another 6 months, and somewhere during that incarceration, something had shifted. Derek had entered a court-mandated treatment program and had apparently been sober for 18 months. His parents had sent Sophie a carefully worded letter asking if she'd be willing to have supervised contact with Derek as part of his recovery program, but Sophie had declined. She'd written back explaining that she wished Derek well in his sobriety, but that she'd built a life that didn't include him and wasn't interested in reopening that door. The letter had been kind, but firm, and Derek's parents hadn't pushed further. Sophie walked across the stage to accept her diploma, shook hands with the university president, and looked directly at where Amy and I sat in the crowd. She smiled, gave a small wave, and mouthed, "Thank you." It was everything the high school graduation should have been, unmarred by Derek's chaos, purely about Sophie's achievement and future. Afterward, at dinner celebrating her graduation, Sophie announced that she'd accepted a position with a non-profit that worked with children of alcoholics, helping them navigate family systems and build healthy relationships. She'd turned her trauma into purpose, found a way to use her experience to help others facing similar struggles. Amy cried proud tears, and I felt the weight of 6 years of fights and fears and small victories culminating in this moment of Sophie choosing to transform pain into service. Derek would always be part of Sophie's story, the cautionary tale and the lost potential, but he wasn't the defining part anymore. That space belonged to Sophie herself, the strong, compassionate, resilient woman she'd become, not because of Derek's failures, but despite them, with help from people who'd loved her through the ugly parts and celebrated the beautiful ones. As we left the restaurant that night, Sophie linked arms with both Amy and me, the three of us walking together like we'd done countless times before. "I have the best parents," she said, loud enough for strangers to hear, claiming the relationship without qualification or apology. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes families aren't born. They're built brick by brick through choices and commitment and showing up day after day. Derek had the biology, but I had the years and the trust and the love that actually mattered. Sophie was mine because we'd chosen each other, and no court or blood tie could make that more real than it already was.